Good afternoon, everyone. We'll begin momentarily. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Blaise Mishtal, the Vice President of Policy at GINSA, and I'm delighted to have all of you tune in to our discussion this afternoon about the possibility of new U.S. talks with Iran over its nuclear program and the risks that those talks might entail. At the end of last year, Iran Policy Project published a report urging the Trump administration that Iran's nuclear program should be a day one priority, in which the task force wrote that from the day President-elect Trump takes office, he will have almost zero time or margin for error to prevent a nuclear Iran. His administration must build truly maximum pressure, including credible threats of force, whether or not Washington and Tehran return to the negotiating table. Iran thus has every incentive to reprise its playbook from the Obama and Biden years, exploiting diplomacy as cover to further advance and harden its nuclear infrastructure, and ultimately wasting time until the possibility of snapping back painful UN Security Council sanctions expires permanently in October of this year. Given that, the task force urged President Trump to replace his predecessor's patient conciliation with determined coercion. Above all, he must leverage maximum pressure to drive a hard bargain, adhere to a strict timeline to yield results, and be prepared to walk away immediately and work with Israel to neutralize Iran's nuclear infrastructure militarily. We're now several months into the new administration, and we've learned that President Trump has sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader in suggestion, perhaps, of having nuclear negotiations. And so I'm delighted to be joined by some of the co-authors of that report to discuss where we are and where we're going. The co-chair of our Iran Policy Project and GINSA Distinguished Fellow, Ambassador Eric Edelman, and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, former Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela in the first Trump administration, Elliot Abrams, and Stephen Rademacher, a senior advisor at GINSA and former Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Nonproliferation. Elliot, maybe I could start with you and get your download on what the state of play currently is. President Trump has sent a letter. The Iranians, I guess, have said they're mulling it over. Do we know what was in the letter? Do we know sort of what the state of play is?
As you said, the questions are, where are we and where are we going? And I think it's pretty clear no one knows where we are or where we're going. A reminder first that in the first Trump term, the maximum pressure campaign with respect to Iran was meant to force them into a negotiation. Trump has always wanted a negotiation. His view was that the JCPOA was a poorly negotiated and poor agreement, and that we needed a better agreement that would, for example, not be time limited, and would cover more than Iran's nuclear program. It would cover the missile program. It would cover Iran's support for regional proxies, support for terrorism. That was the policy of the first term. So far, it looks as if that policy is being continued. Sanctions are being reimposed, and the president's discussion of Iran, when he has talked about it, has been they can't have a nuclear weapon. There are two ways to reach that goal: through negotiations or through military strikes. That sounds like pretty much the same policy. I think there are a number of critical questions now. One of them is the one that you mentioned, which is time. Time will run out on snapback, and also, of course, as time passes, they build their nuclear program, certainly with respect to the amount of enriched uranium they have and how much they have and how protected and dispersed their nuclear weapons program is, time is on their side. The second question, and I'll stop with this, is about our ability to negotiate this. I don't know how the president plans to do this. It looks as if he plans to have Steve Witkoff do it. The problem is that Witkoff doesn't really know anything about the details here. That is, if you think of him negotiating on Ukraine, that's an easy problem compared to the Iranian nuclear question, which I would argue takes a lot more detailed expertise about what we want, what we should be demanding from Iran. Now, admittedly, when the last time we did this, if you will, in the JCPOA, the whole expertise of the US government was available. And in my view, Secretary of State Kerry negotiated an awful agreement and negotiated very poorly. So, that would suggest that having the whole bureaucracy behind you doesn't guarantee any great outcome anyway. But I do think that question still remains. Who is that delegation that goes to negotiate? How do we negotiate? We negotiate with Iran. Do we negotiate up to a point anyway via cutouts? And who are they? Qatar? One has read a suggestion that Iran would be involved in this. Sorry, that Russia would be involved in this Iran negotiation. Having the Russians involved in this seems really crazy to me. So I think those are questions that remain to be answered in the next few months. I guess I'd add one final point, which is things have changed a lot for Israel, more than they have changed for us in the last couple of years, in the years since Trump has been president. And that's a new factor, whether the Israelis are willing to sit by and watch Iran play out the clock.
Ambassador Edelman, maybe I could ask you the flip side of that question, which is, do we know where the Iranians are at on possible negotiations? I seem to remember them speaking favorably of negotiations sort of at the end of last year, but in the several months of this year, they seem to have been more reticent. Do we know where they stand?
I don't think we've got a clear view of where they stand, Blaze, but there does seem to be a debate going on. I mean, the Supreme Leader has made comments saying he doesn't think there's any point in negotiating with President Trump. Other hardliners have said there's no point in negotiating with the United States because they can always break the agreement as they have in the past. But President Pezeshkian does seem to be anxious to get the sanctions lifted. And so there's a debate going on. I would note something else. There was a fascinating article in Foreign Affairs that posted yesterday about what domestic developments in Iran might tell us about where things are headed. And it makes the case that there is actually an effort at some reform domestically in Iran, and some effort to ease up on some of the enforcement of Sharia, etc., as a way of sort of allowing a safety valve to be exercised in the population, and therefore to be able to better rally the population in standing up against U.S. pressure as the pressure campaign kind of winds itself up here. And I guess I would add to what Elliot said earlier, all of which I agree with, that I had been a little concerned at the beginning of the administration that there was a bandwidth problem with regard to Iran. Our report basically said this needed to be really right at the top of the administration's agenda. And in the first 53 days or so, you would be hard pressed to say this was at the top of the agenda. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine, tariffs, other issues have been at the fore. And Steve Witkoff, in whom the president seems, as Elliot correctly pointed out, to repose enormous confidence as a negotiator, has not only been tied up with the Ukraine negotiations, has also been tied up with the Gaza negotiations, which now seem to have collapsed over the potential extension of the first phase of the ceasefire, and we're now back in a combat phase in Gaza. So Witkoff's time is heavily already committed in other areas, and whether he even has the bandwidth to be the Iran negotiator, I think, is an open question. And although there were reports that he was going to take that responsibility, I don't think there's ever been, an official designation of him as the Iran negotiator. So I think we have to, kind of see, where that is. Now, having said all that, the imposition of sanctions, obviously, or reimposition of sanctions, should say, sanctions that were on the books but not being enforced by the Biden administration, additional designations that have been made, all of that have really cranked up the pressure and have resulted in some of the domestic debate that I mentioned a second ago. But also the strikes on the Houthis in Yemen over the last 2 days, which are by far more serious than anything undertaken during the Biden administration, going after leadership targets, for example, in a much more sustained way, and with a very explicit warning. I mean, this was it's of course related to, the transit of the Red Sea, but it's, in my view, much more related to sending a message to Iran that, there is not endless patience with regard to the question of whether Iran does or doesn't engage in negotiations, and that there is a military potential option against them. And that is the difference, I think, in what we've seen previously, frankly, from not just the Biden administration, I would say even from the first Trump administration in that sense. And that, I do think, is a positive sign. And we'll see how it plays out. I just add one other little detail, which is that in the White House readout of the president's phone call with President Putin today, they did apparently have a discussion about Iran, and the two presidents, according to the White House readout, agreed that Iran should not have the capability to destroy Israel. And that, what that, says about future Russian involvement, to Elliot's point, I don't know. But it shows that this is something still on the president's mind, even as he's working on the Ukraine problem.
Thanks, Ambassador. Steve, let me turn to you and pick up on something that Elliot mentioned, which is the issue of time. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit to us on what the constraints on time are, and in particular, snapback and the sort of legality and process issues around UN Security Council Resolution 2231?
Yes, that's an important question, and it is, I think a consideration that is increasingly relevant to how this may play out. The UN resolution that was adopted in 2015 to basically implement the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was, as you say, Resolution 2231. That resolution expires 10 years after its adoption, and that expiration will fall on October 18th of this year. When the resolution expires, the snapback mechanism that it contained will also expire. And just to elaborate on that, one of the main things the resolution did was it suspended all the previous UN Security Council resolutions imposing various restrictions, various sanctions on Iran. But it did not permanently eliminate those restrictions. It suspended them, and it included a mechanism whereby any of the signatories of the JCPOA was authorized to sort of trigger a process at the Security Council that would virtually automatically result in the termination of the suspension. In other words, the reimposition of the previously imposed sanctions and prohibitions. That snapback mechanism will expire on October 18 when the rest of the resolution expires. So this is an important tool that has existed over the last 10 years. Late in the Trump administration, the Trump administration sought to use that mechanism, but it was argued at the time that because the Trump administration had withdrawn formally from the JCPOA, that the U.S. had lost its right, its ability under Resolution 2231 to trigger a snapback. So even though the Trump administration went through the necessary steps, the rest of the world refused to acknowledge that a snapback had occurred. I don't think that consensus can be reversed, but I do think it's obvious that any of the other JCPOA participating countries could trigger a snapback, and that means in particular that Britain, France, or Germany would have the ability to do that. And one of the features of the presidential directive that was issued on February 4th of this year was that President Trump directed the State Department to advocate for a snapback. And what that means in practical terms is Secretary Rubio is directed to work with the British, French, and German governments, any one of which independently could trigger a snapback. And this is essentially a wasting asset. If it's not triggered by October 18th, the possibility of triggering it will permanently disappear. The factual predicate for triggering a snapback, essentially that Iran is in non-compliance with its obligations under the JCPOA, is indisputable. No one would contend that Iran is currently complying with its nuclear-related obligations. So I think there's actually a decent chance that one of these European countries will acquiesce to the requests of the Trump administration, and maybe for their own reasons, because if it's not done now, it can never be done. And given the current disagreements among the permanent members of the Security Council, it's inconceivable that anytime in the near future, consensus could be achieved in the Security Council to adopt restrictions like those that were adopted in the early 2000s. So snapback is really the only way to get UN restrictions back in place. And I think if the Trump administration is going to negotiate with Iran, what is it going to seek to achieve? Well, one thing I think would have a strong position going into this negotiations to argue that they were seeking to require Iran to comply with UN Security Council mandates. And of course, today there are no Security Council mandates other than those in 2231. But if there's a snapback, it's a much more robust set of UN demands on Iran, including that they permanently, well, not permanently, but that they suspend all enrichment reprocessing activities, suspend construction of the Iraq light water reactor. So I think the Trump administration will have a much stronger hand in negotiations if it's basically speaking on behalf of compliance with UN Security Council mandates.
Does that mean that?
Blaise,
Yeah, go ahead, Ambassador.
Yeah, just to add to what Steve said, my impression is, from talking to European colleagues, that this is an area like the others that Elliot described, that things are different than they were in the first term. I mean, there is absolutely no debate at all about Iranian noncompliance. In the fall of 2020, when Secretary Pompeo was trying to work this with the allies, there was a whole argument about, well, they're not in compliance, but that's because the U.S. is out, pulled out of the agreement. But now there's just no debate because the Iranian noncompliance is so flagrant that the allies themselves, I think, at least certainly the British and the French, are strongly motivated, I think, to want to see snapback be put into place. So I think that the diplomatic landscape has changed, is much more favorable to the Trump administration than it was in the fall of 2020. And I also think that for those of us who argued against the JCPOA in 2015 and testified against it in the Congress, one of the arguments that we made was all of these deadlines, 5, 10, and 15 years that littered the agreement, seemed to be so far away in 2015 when people were considering it. And most of us were making the point that this time is going to go by faster than you think. And so here we are with one of the major tools about to expire. And I think it's just a living proof of the frailty and weakness of the 2015 JCPOA.
I was going to ask, well, I guess first I would observe that Iran's involvement in the Ukraine war in support of Russia, I think, has also tilted the playing field in Europe against it, in addition to its various violations of the JCPOA. But to what extent then is October 18th a hard and fast deadline for getting a deal with the Iranians? Is invoking snapback necessary to get a deal? Is having it in your back pocket necessary to have a deal? Would it be possible to get one even after it has expired? I guess, Elliot, to what extent does maximum pressure include multilateral pressure, or are U.S. sanctions considered to be enough?
Well, the UN sanctions would help because there are a number of countries that won't comply or will try not to comply with unilateral American sanctions, but will comply with UN sanctions. So I think it would help. Do we need to snap back to negotiate a deal with Iran? Well, not if the Iranians are willing to accept a deal. I mean, theoretically, you could do a deal by July 1. Start negotiating now, and the snapback question is not reached. And I think that we can fully expect the Iranians to say that if snapback is imposed, not only will they refuse to negotiate, they'll leave the non-proliferation treaty, they'll do all sorts of terrible things. It's doomsday if snapback is invoked. That's predictable. I mean, it's a negotiating position, and I think it's natural in a sense for them to say those things, though they are not true. That is, I think that more critical here is the American sanctions and the threat of a military strike. That, I think, is what will or won't motivate Iran to negotiate. As Eric said, we know there's a debate in Tehran. This is the Supreme Leader is, I think, 86. The Trump years arguably will be his last years. And he needs to make a decision about what's best for Iran as he sees it. That is the survival of the regime best guaranteed by the effort to develop a nuclear weapon and the development of it while he's still in power, or is it best guaranteed by some kind of deal with the Americans? It creates a form of economic stability and diplomatic stability, avoids a military strike in these years that may be the years of transition for the first time in decades in Iran. And transition, I would say, to a situation that probably won't look like the last transition. That transition was from one religious leader to another. And the Supreme Leader, Khamenei, has full power in Iran. That is, he can give orders to the Revolutionary Guards, to the army, to the clerics, to everyone. It's not at all clear that his successor will have that power, especially in the early years. He may consolidate it or may not. But early on, one can envision a struggle for power among institutions in Iran. So the Supreme Leader's got to sort of figure out what is safest for the revolution, for the Islamic Republic. And that will be a debate. That is a debate in Tehran, just as in the US and in Israel, there are debates about the utility of such a negotiation with Iran, as opposed to this window of opportunity for a military strike that brings their nuclear weapons program, if not to a permanent close, to a close for some time.
So I guess on that point, Steve, let me ask you first, but curious to hear everyone's thoughts on what what a good deal would be from the U.S. perspective. What what should we demand? What could we live with? And I guess let me ask, not just on the nuclear program, but are other things, should other things be on the table as well? I guess notably when President Biden said he was going to renegotiate or re-enter the JCPOA, he said that would be a prelude to a JCPOA 2.0, which would have not just the nuclear issue on the table, not just be longer and stronger on nukes, but also include ballistic missiles and support for terrorism and other issues. Should all of those be on the table now too for the Trump administration, or should it just be a nuclear deal strictly?
Well, that's a critically important question, and I don't know that as Ellie said at the outset, I don't think we know what the administration's thinking, and I think the reality is they probably haven't even begun to think through that question. Iran is such a bad actor that if we come up with a list of our demands, it's a pretty long list, things that we'd like to see change. And I think there is, it's tempting, of course, to demand progress, demand concessions on everything that bothers us about the regime. But I do think there is a practical reality that, if we ask for basically a fundamental transformation of the Iranian government, that's probably asking too much. I mean, they're in a worse situation than they were a few years ago, but I don't think they're in a desperate situation where, they're prepared to fundamentally transform who they are, because we're insisting on it. The previous Trump administration confronted precisely this question. Secretary Pompeo gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation. He outlined 12 demands. They sort of tilted in favor of maximal requirements, and I think we'll see whether this Trump administration comes up with the same list of maximal demands, but not just missile or not just nuclear, getting the nuclear program under control, but missiles and support for terrorism, support for other regional proxies, how it conducts its relations with other countries in the region. I guess my personal view is that the number one consideration, number one concern that we have to have with the Iranian regime is its nuclear program. We've just had several demonstrations of their missile capabilities, and that was a manageable problem. But if one of those Iranian missiles had a nuclear weapon on it and had managed to break through Israeli air defenses, as a small number of the Iranian missiles did, the situation in the Middle East would be fundamentally different than the one we see today. So I do think our number one priority should be the nuclear program, and within that priority, I'd say certainly a political requirement for President Trump is to come back with a better deal than the JCPOA. I mean, if having, brought upon the United States and brought upon his administration the opprobrium of, much of the world by walking away from the JCPOA on grounds that it was a bad deal, if, many years later he negotiates essentially the same deal, or a deal that suffers from many of the same defects as the JCPOA, everyone will reasonably ask, why did you go? Why did you do this? What have you accomplished? So if it were up to me, my advice to the Trump administration would be focus on the nuclear program, but make sure you come back with a better deal. And I'd say the number one element of that has to be not some sort of temporary restraint on enrichment and reprocessing activities that will expire at some point in the future, when hopefully Iran will be a different country than it is today, but rather permanent restrictions. And to me, that was always the fundamental, of the many problems with the JCPOA, the most fundamental was that it was going to expire. And, as Eric pointed out, we're getting close to expiration at this point of most of those restrictions. And Iran has not fundamentally changed. That was sort of the theory of the Obama administration, that, with the passage of time and with goodwill expressed by us and our allies, the regime will change, and we can live with them. We can trust them to to not be subject to UN restrictions. We can trust them not to be subject to export controls on the kinds of technology that they can import from us and our allies. They haven't changed. They can't be trusted to import whatever they want. So my advice to the Trump administration would be focus on nuclear and get a really strong nuclear deal.
I mean, there is a problem in that. I mean, the logic of it is very strong. But suppose you get a good nuclear deal and sanctions are lifted. And then you, President Trump, are asked the following day, yeah, fine. But they're shipping enormous amounts of money and guns to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, who are attacking American and other ships in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandab. They're trying to dominate Iraq through their Shia militias that they support. What kind of a deal was that? So I think that's a problem. Conversely, if you did a deal in which they gave up the kind of death to Israel, death to America actions, never mind the rhetoric, actions, they gave up the nuclear program, they gave up the support for proxies, support for terrorist groups, then, will the regime survive? In a sense, those activities are really at the heart of the regime. What is it there for? As Ruel Gerecht, friend who is an Iran analyst, has put it, there are three pillars of this regime: death to America, death to Israel, and suppression of women, the hijab. So we're asking him to give up a lot, which is why I think I am at least pessimistic about the possibility of a successful negotiation. Successful meaning one that does what Steve Rademacher is suggesting it needs to do.
Yeah. So Blaise, can I comment in quick
Please.
response? Yeah. So you make good points, but I guess my response would be these other problems can be addressed by other tools besides a signed agreement. I mean, the Hamas problem. Well, Israel has done a pretty good job addressing the Hamas problem. The Hezbollah problem, same. The Houthi problem, not yet addressed, but the Trump administration, I applaud what they recently said. We're going to bomb these guys, but actually, we no longer buy the fiction that they are the problem. We understand that they're basically proxies for the people who are the real problem, and we're going to hold those guys, the Iranians, responsible for further actions by the Houthis.
That does,
And, we do a nuclear deal with Iran, we don't have to promise as part of that if they unleash the Houthis again to shut down shipping in the Red Sea, that we will not retaliate against Iran directly for that. So,
can I get into this free for all for a second?
Please.
Because Elliot and I served in an administration that negotiated sort of arms agreements with the Soviet Union while it was doing a bunch of other things at the same time. And I think if to get at what the Trump administration ought to want to accomplish by negotiations, if it ends up in a negotiation, and then there's a whole question about whether it even makes sense to do that because of what we know the Iranian playbook is, which is to string things out, drive it past October or so, snapback goes away. Meanwhile, they're enriching uranium and, getting closer and closer by salami tactics to a nuclear weapon. But the things that really, I think, undermined the Obama administration's effort to negotiate a strong and lasting agreement were, first of all, an unwillingness to stick to its own precepts. I mean, they began with the proposition that Iran should not have access to the full nuclear fuel cycle, and over time gave way bit by bit to allowing Iran to have an industrial scale, enrichment capability that was enshrined in the agreement, and also allowed for them to at least research more advanced centrifuges, so that by the time the agreement ran out, they would, as Obama himself admitted, be a day away from having the ability to, create enough fissile material for nuclear weapons. So the unwillingness to stick to your basic precepts and say, we're not going to budge, as Ronald Reagan did essentially with the INF treaty. When people were saying you can't negotiate that because it's, the Soviets will never agree to it. Well, you can overcome that actually. The other was a refusal to contest Iran in a lot of other areas where it was misbehaving, its support for proxies, what it was doing in Syria, what it was doing at home on human rights. And, the Reagan administration, again, Elliot and I worked for Secretary of State George Shultz, who told his Soviet counterparts, I'm going to start every discussion we have with human rights. I know you hate that, but it's an important part of what we do. And we're not stopping, and we're not going to hold it hostage to negotiating with you on, strategic nuclear arms control. So I think if the administration basically comes in with a position that says, we're not going to go back to the days, you can have access to nuclear power, but not the whole fuel cycle. And you're not going to have enrichment capability, certainly not anything like at the scale that we've allowed heretofore. And oh, by the way, don't expect us to shut up about your human rights violations and to not help Israel destroy Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis, because we're not going to do that. And we're going to arm our allies in the region to, make your ballistic missile capability, less of a threat to them. And we're not going to stop doing that either. I think, do I think there's a big chance they could get agreement? No. But if you're going to go down that path, that's the way I would argue you should do it.
It's difficult. I was just going to say, if you think of, you sign the deal on Monday with Iran, and Tuesday you bomb them because the Houthis have attacked an American ship in the Red Sea. It's a very difficult balance to maintain. I'd add one additional factor, which we know, actually all three of us served in the Reagan administration as well. And if you sign an arms control agreement, there's a tendency to want to defend it. So somebody comes and says, they're cheating. The human reaction, certainly the bureaucratic reaction, is to say, oh, be quiet. You just put a year of effort into this deal. And here comes somebody who says they're cheating, and you don't want to hear that. You want it to continue. You don't want to look like a fool for having trusted them to keep an agreement. So there's at least a bureaucratic momentum here on behalf of a deal. Maybe in the case of Iran, it would be less because it's such an evil regime, and we've had bad dealings with it since really the day it was born. But I'm a pessimist on this.
I don't know. The Soviet regime was pretty evil, and we still had a whole bureaucracy arguing that a lot of things that were clearly arms control violations were not violations. So, and look how long it took even to get the State Department to agree that they were violating the INF treaty. That took 3-4 years for them to finally come around.
So I just want to build on one point that you made, Eric. Your comments about the mistakes of the Obama administration in negotiating the JCPOA. I watched those negotiations carefully, and I also watched the previous negotiations they had with the Russians to extend the what became the New START treaty. The fundamental mistake of the Obama administration in both of those negotiations was they got themselves into a process that they became unwilling to see fail.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
In the end, they put the onus on themselves to succeed.
Yes.
A failure of either of those negotiations was not going to be a failure by the Russians or failure by the Iranians. It was going to be a failure by them. And once you are in a negotiation that you're not prepared to see fail, you are going to get a bad deal. Assuming the other side insists on driving a
Yes.
hard bargain. And that was precisely the position they put themselves in. And so if we're going to advise the Trump administration here, one of the key pieces of advice has to be, do not, make that same mistake. I mean, if you sit down and talk to the Iranians and they're just intransigent, you can't keep coming back to them with better and better offers. That was what the Obama administration did in the JCPOA. They were just constantly, going to their bottom line and then reassessing the bottom line and coming back with a new offer.
Yeah, I'd like the record to show that I think John Rood and I had left the Obama administration with a ton of leverage because we had completely convinced the Russians that we absolutely did not give a shit if the START agreements expired and that there was no successor. They were absolutely convinced that we didn't care. And so they had all the leverage in the world, and they, within a matter of weeks, had, as you say, Steve, reversed it and put all the onus on themselves.
Well, this is a wonderful panel to moderate because it doesn't require a lot of engagement from me, and you're preempting and answering all my questions already. But let me maybe pick up where you left off, Steve, and ask all of you. You've laid out some of the risks of negotiating with Iran. Ambassador Edelman, you said they'll try to just drag things out to get snapback to expire and sort of mire us in process. You sort of also suggested that getting the sort of deal that Steve laid out might be hard to do. Given all of that, given the risks, given the low chance of success, if President Trump is going to go ahead and negotiate with the Iranians, how do you mitigate those risks? How do you give yourself the best chance of success? What would your recommendations for how to proceed be?
I'm happy to start.
Not all at once.
I'll start. And I think the main point I'd make is one that I think we've already made in this discussion, and that is he needs like a serious negotiating team to hammer out a good deal. As I think it was Elliot who said, the Iran negotiation is far more complex, going to be far more complex than the Ukraine negotiation. The JCPOA, I think, was 159 pages long, but if you read those 159 pages, I mean, it is incredibly detailed. There are annexes and an enormous amount of work had to go into preparing the provisions of the JCPOA, and they were all hard fought, hard negotiated. It took them, I think nearly 2 years to hammer out all of those provisions. The people who do that are experts. These are not, this is not Secretary Rubio sitting down with his Iranian counterpart and agreeing on this. I mean, the experts, in endless discussions, work these things out, and they will need if it's going to be a serious agreement with teeth in it that prevent Iran from doing the things we're trying to prevent. Those kinds of people are going to have to be involved, and I do worry because the closest thing to an Iran negotiation that we saw under the previous Trump administration was the North Korea negotiation that President Trump conducted personally, in large measure. He decided he wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. It was an unprecedented step. I forget whether he met with him 2 or 3 times, but if you're not going to negotiate the details of an agreement at the Secretary of State level, you're definitely not going to negotiate them at the President Trump level. I mean, his focus is not going to be on the fine print. And I think, looking back on that negotiation with North Korea, the North Koreans tried to take full advantage of that. The Trump administration tried to appoint an expert to head up, be the head of the negotiating team. That was Steve Biegun, who later became the Deputy Secretary of State. Steve, I think was cut out to do that job, but the North Koreans decided very quickly they didn't like him because they had these great meetings with President Trump where it was all, bonding and, warm feelings. And then Biegun would show up with, the list of 50 demands and, concrete, we need this, we need that. And the North Koreans were like, we like that other guy much better. That's who we want to deal with. And if Trump, falls, doesn't resist the temptation to try and do this personally, I just worry that the Iranians are not going to want to talk to the experts. They're going to want to talk to the top guy, and any deal that's reached at that level, I think, is going to be a very weak deal, just because without the technical constraints that are necessary to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapons program, we will end up with a deal that probably serves Iran's interests more than our own.
Yeah, I'd just add to what Steve said that, I mean, I think if you're going to get into this kind of negotiation, first of all, you have to be very mindful of the clock and not let it be used against you, but use it to your advantage. And there are ways to do that. Blaze, you and your colleagues at JINSA had a wonderful graphic about the number of times that Tony Blinken said there's limited amount of time to negotiate, a JCPOA 8.2, and that limited amount of time just kept getting longer and longer and longer.
There was days left for months.
Yeah, well, and that in and of itself, by the way, sends a signal to the other side of your, lack of serious intent of being able to walk away. Now, the president always likes to say, the key to a good negotiation is being prepared to get up and walk away. And he's right about that. It's very hard for us to do in the U.S. government for a lot of the reasons that, Elliot mentioned, which is a sort of bureaucratic, impulses and inertia. And for negotiators, particularly career people who end up, my foreign service colleagues are going to kill me for saying this, but for career people who get, put in these positions of being negotiator, if failure is, a reflection in some sense on your diplomatic skill, or at least it's seen that way. It shouldn't be, in my view. I mean, actually the person who gets up and walks away ought to be seen as the better negotiator in some circumstances, but that's not always the way it's seen, bureaucratically. And so you really have to, I think, be very disciplined about this. And disciplined about not negotiating with ourselves. In the United States government, we love to do this. We like to negotiate with ourselves before we actually sit down with the other guys. And so we like to negotiate, okay, what's going to be a negotiating position that the other guy can agree to so we could get to an agreement. And that's, again, I think the wrong way to do it. I think we have to understand our own position, what our own red lines are, go in, stick to them, try to be flexible in areas where you can be flexible to, meet the other side's need, but have really rigid timelines and know what you can't give away, and then stick to all of that, which we're very bad at doing.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Guess I'd add, yes, we need to put together a professional negotiating team, an expert team under whoever is the chief negotiator. I think we also should say to the Iranians on day one, snapback is going to go into effect unless we have a deal. There will be no extensions. Snapback is going to go into effect. Then we continue to negotiate. Maybe snapback is in effect for 11 days. Maybe it's 11 weeks, but I think we need to prevent them from using the clock against us, because they will. They'll have a very skilled negotiating team. The people are there in the U.S. government, in the Defense Department, in the State Department, in various other pieces of the U.S. government, experienced people. I don't gainsay the idea, which is apparently President Trump's, that Steve Witkoff is a good negotiator, and that he's been negotiating for 30 years. That may well be true, but the expertise he needs to be surrounded by expertise.
Let me turn to a question that we received from General Chuck Wald, actually co-chair of our Iran policy project. He asks, how and when do you add the threat of kinetic action into the negotiations, or should we? And let me add on to that, maybe. Should we see the strikes over the last 3 days against the Houthis as part of President Trump's Iran policy? Is it related to negotiations in Iran's nuclear program? Is it separate? And I'll also, one more addition, for those of you who are interested in that question, we will actually have a webinar tomorrow with three former commanders from Central Command, commander of the Fifth Fleet, commander of the Air Force's Central Command, and a deputy CENTCOM commander, talking specifically about the Houthi issue. So we can go more into depth then, but I'm just interested about how it relates to the Iran question now.
I will say it's out there. I mean, the president has said certain things. So they form the background to the negotiation, as does the CENTCOM attacks on the Houthis right now. I mean, that's just a fact.
George Kennan gave a lecture at the National War College in 1946 in which he said, "You have no idea how much more constructive and collegial diplomacy is if you have a little quiet military force sitting in the background." And so I agree with Elliot. I think, first of all, these strikes are very salutary if we end up in the negotiation, because they do show a willingness to take kinetic action against, in a much more serious way than the previous administration, against the kind of last man standing, if you will, among Iran's group of proxies, or the one that's been the least diminished so far. But I don't think that will be the end of it. I think there would probably need to be additional joint exercises with Israel while we're negotiating. I know that for those people who want to prioritize the Indo-Pacific, what I'm about to say is heresy, but I think having two carrier strike groups in the region while the negotiations are going on probably makes sense. And there are probably other steps we could be taking, things we've advocated before in terms of providing Israel with tanking capability and replenishing war reserve stocks that have been drawn down in Israel because of the fighting in Ukraine and elsewhere. I mean, so a whole series of steps I think that you would want to take that would continue to signal the potential for kinetic action, in addition to the statements the president's made. I mean, he said that it's, there's the easy way and the hard way to solve this. And, I think that, those kind of statements are important, but they need to be backed up by visible signs of actual willingness to engage in that. This is one of the things that, again, I think disabled the Obama administration, which is, they kept saying, all steps are, on the table, but nobody, I mean, if you ask Gary Seymour, who was the senior director for nonproliferation in the first few years of the Obama administration, he would privately admit that there was no credible threat of military force that they had at their, at their beck and call, and as a result, it disabled their ability to negotiate.
Just one other point on that, and that is, the Iranians may want this negotiation in part to tie the hands of the Israelis. That is, they may be thinking that the United States, while negotiating with the Israelis, don't do anything. And if told, well, we've made a decision, we are going to hit the Iranian nuclear program, the United States would say, no, we're in the middle of negotiations. Wait. That's something that the United States and Israel are going to have to work out as well.
Do you have any sense of what President Trump's inclinations on that might be, or what his thinking on it was, at least in the first term?
My impression is that he probably would not block an Israeli attack if the Israelis said, now is the moment, we have reached a national consensus, civilian and military leadership, and this is our window. I think more likely than not, he would say, I will not block it.
Ambassador Edelman, since you mentioned carrier strike groups in the Middle East, let me pose a question to you in our last minutes that we got from Jay Solomon at the Free Press. This is more related to the Houthi issue, and I can pose this again tomorrow when we have our discussion, but maybe you have thoughts. Jay says, I noticed that the strikes on the Houthis are being conducted from strike carrier groups operating in the Gulf, not military assets based at Al Udeid. Does Qatar block the Pentagon from using Al Udeid for such operations? What's the point of having a major base there if we can't use it?
I don't know whether that's the case or not, but since Elliot and I, advocated at the time that we should not allow ourselves to be essentially hornswoggled by the Qataris because they had provided very generously to support CENTCOM Forward at Al Udeid, that we needed to consider either moving CENTCOM Forward's headquarters or finding other ways to prevent them from influencing our policy. And there's no question that it had influence on our military colleagues, who understandably, felt that disrupting, operations, if we had to suddenly move the, CENTCOM Forward, would be really problematic. Plus, getting foreign military construction funding out of Congress is extremely difficult. Of all the kinds of, color of money issues we have in the Pentagon, MILCON money is the hardest, and foreign MILCON money is like, in the ultra hard category. So all of that was completely understandable, but it did unfortunately allow Qatar to have disproportionate influence, on U.S. policy. And I don't know whether these current strikes have been carrier-based because of some kind of veto by Qatar or not, but it wouldn't altogether surprise me if it were the case.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. If there are, in fact, negotiations or further developments, I look forward to having you all back to discuss those. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. If you're interested, please look out for the invite for the webinar tomorrow with our U.S. CENTCOM commanders talking about the Houthi strikes. That'll be tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. And please check out the Iran Task Force's report on our website at jinsa.org. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.